I used to be a property manager in London back in the 80s. For one reason or another, the flats I managed weren't strictly legal, so it was basically my job to collect rent, arrange repairs, and be a buffer between the real owner and the council, should they ever find out he was flouting regulations. It was a proper cash under the table sort of thing, and we didn't discriminate when it came to tenants. If you could give us the month's rent, which was about 60 quid back then we'd give you a bedroom in a shared house with communal kitchen and bathroom facilities. These days, a lot of landlords ask foreigners for proof of their right to be in the country, and I think you can get into trouble if you're found to be housing illegal immigrants. But back then, we weren't in the least bit interested in who you were or where you were from. All we wanted was money. And the same applied when I met a guy called Yuri. Yuri mentioned something about being from Latvia, but I never saw any papers to confirm that. His name could have been anything, and he could have been from anywhere. I met him outside this crumbling down house in Finsbury, one of the properties that I managed. Heavy emphasis on those quotation marks there, and the room that he was after was a mess. There was peeling wallpaper, damp patches everywhere, and a stink that was sort of half mold and half despair. It was the kind of place that you'd give a rat the hump, and Yuri didn't quite seem desperate enough to rent it. But after a brief look around, he told me he'd take it. I was surprised, honestly, but I wasn't about to argue with the man. I just took his money, gave him his keys, and that was that. Next month, when I went around to collect the rent, Yuri wasn't in. He cleaned the place up quite nicely, gotten rid of all the mold and the peeling wallpaper, and he left a little note on his bed that just said, "Busy at work, money in pillowcase." We dealt with some quite unsavory characters on a regular basis, and I'd had someone try and run a scam like that on me before. As they say, if you play with feathers, you get your arse tickled. When their rent money wasn't in the pillowcase, they said someone must have gone into their room before I did and pinched the cash. And since it wasn't their fault, they didn't think that they should have to pay twice the rent money, and that caused an awful lot of trouble for that character, let me tell you. I was thinking, good God, not another one of these. But then, when I put my hand in the pillowcase, Bob's your uncle, there was the money. It was like that every month too, but it suited me down to the ground. I never had to chase him or go looking for him. He was reliable as anyone was, old Yuri. But then came the month when, well, you'll see what I mean in a moment, won't you? It was a grim Tuesday lunchtime, all gray and dreary out when I drove over to the house in Finsbury to collect the rent. The place was dead quiet, with most out grafting in some manner or another, nothing but the hum of traffic outside and the occasional cough from the guy down below's ground floor flat. So I knocked on Yuri's door, just out of habit really, and when there was no answer, as per usual, I just pushed it open. His room was just the same as ever. Bare except a single bed, a rickety old chair, and a wardrobe that was well on its last legs. I went for the pillowcase, expecting to find the cash in the usual place, but there was nothing. I patted it down and shook it a bit, but still nothing fell out. That wasn't like Yuri at all. He'd only been renting about 6 months, but he'd always paid on time and in the same fashion, good as gold. Then I opened the old wardrobe to see if his clothes were still there and saw they were all gone. It was completely gutted. I hardly ever found a reliable tenant like him, not in our game, so it always stung a bit whenever they decided to move someplace else. I was about to leave, and I was right on my way out the door when I spotted something under the bed. It was a suitcase, brown leather and bashed up around the edges. I'm not one for poking my nose in where it doesn't belong, but something didn't feel right. All of Yuri's stuff was gone, and he hadn't left any rent money either. So what was his suitcase doing under his bed? I thought for a second, then said to myself, "Stuff it. I'll have a quick look and see if there's a note or something." I walked back in, shut the door, kneeled down next to the bed, and pulled out the suitcase. I flicked the latch, lifted the lid, and my heart stopped. There was Yuri, inside the suitcase, his body all twisted up and broken, like someone had to fold him up to fit him inside. His arms looked snapped and bent at odd angles, while his legs were tucked under him backwards. His face was all gray and his eyes were wide open, staring out blankly. There was nothing else. Just him, stuffed inside like he was something to be thrown away. I got up and stumbled back, hand clamped over my mouth to keep the smell out of my nose, but I still felt sick. The room started spinning, and the next thing, I'm out the door and taking the stairs 2 at a time. I pulled the front door open, ran out into the street before I stopped. I remember how my hand shook as I fumbled for my pack of cigarettes. I lit one and took a long drag, but it did nothing to calm me down. And as I paced back and forth outside the house, I wondered, what the hell was I going to do? At the time, I knew the owner of the property, a man who will remain nameless, was quite an active figure in London's criminal underworld. I just didn't know to what extent. That meant that he'd probably go mental if I just phoned the police and invited them into one of his gaffes. But this wasn't just a broken window or a tenant who wouldn't pay up. This was a goddamn body. I dug out a few coins from my pocket and walked to the phone box around the corner, and from there I rang the owner, the cig burning down my fingers as I dialed his number. His missus picked up the phone, handed it over to him, then I told him all about the body in the suitcase. I obviously didn't just come out and say it, not over the phone, but we had a way of talking back then where you said things without saying them. Once he'd gotten the gist of it, I thought that the owner was going to flip his lid, but instead, he stayed calm, a bit too calm under the circumstances, and asked me if I was sure the tenant had departed. When I told him I was sure as eggs, he told me not to involve anyone else and asked where the tenant was right now. Then when I told him, he asked me to help the tenant move out. I told him in so many words anyway, that if he thought that I was getting involved in a murder, he was mad. I said we needed to call the police, limit what they were told about the properties and the tenants, then hope they breezed past us without getting a whiff of what we were doing. But the owner wasn't having it. He said if I went to the police, not only would I be out of a job, but I'd also be in serious trouble. Then before I could argue further, he hung up. Until that day, all I knew about the owner of the shared house was that he was involved in renting flats. Well, dodgy ones at that. I might have been a bit of a geezer back then, but I wasn't stupid, and what he said on that phone clued me into the fact that whatever else he was involved in, it was a lot more illegal than just some dodgy flat shares. My heart was pounding after that phone call, my head spinning with all kinds of frightening realizations. For the past God knows how long, I've been working for someone who was now casually telling me to dispose of a body like it was nothing. This was more than just being some dodgy landlord. You'd have to be a real dark kind of person not to even flinch at something like this. But this guy knew my name, my family's names, where I live, everything. But at the same time, my fingerprints were on that suitcase, and if I didn't get out ahead of it and tell the coppers that all I'd done was stumble across it, then there was a good chance that I'd be going down for something, maybe even murder. I didn't want to go back to the house, and I didn't want to just drive home either, so instead, I went to the pub. There was a place called the Red Lion down the road from the phone box, and even though it was only a bit past 12, I drank a pint of lager in about 4 or 5 gulps just to steady my nerves. The barman clocked me and gave me a funny look, but didn't say anything. He just left me to drown my sorrows in peace. Then I sat there, staring at my glass, wondering how everything could go from normal to nightmare so quickly and so drastically. Yuri was a good tenant. He was quiet. He paid me on time. He seemed like a nice bloke too, so who'd do something like that to him and why? After maybe 15 to 20 minutes of staring at the bar top and weighing up my options, I decided to do the smart thing. I fished around my pocket for some more change and walked back to the phone box and phoned the police. The cops turned up about 20 minutes later, 2 of them in a Panda car with their lights flashing, and I was back outside the house by then, so I gave them a wave as they drove down the street, then showed them the upstairs to where Yuri's body was in the suitcase. I only told them what they needed to know, and they said that I'd done the right thing by calling them, but still, I was terrified, because I knew that as soon as my boss got wind that I'd been talking to the police, I'd be in deep, deep doo-doo. That night, I crashed at my mate Dave's place over in Camden. I couldn't go back to my own flat, it'd be too risky, so he gave me a place to sleep for the night. But all I did was lie on his sofa, eyes wide open, thinking about how my life was about to change completely. The next day, I heard word had gotten back to my boss, or by then my former boss, that Yuri's body was with the coroner and that the police were talking to the tenants in the house that he owned. Assuming that was true, my former boss had almost certainly sent people out looking for me, so I asked Dave if I could lie low at his place for a few days until it was safe to return to my flat to grab my stuff. He said that was fine, but I didn't exactly tell him the whole story. If I had, I'm not sure that he'd have let me stay. I didn't go out at all, and Dave definitely knew something was up, but he didn't ask questions. I just kind of hung out on the couch drinking his lager and wondering if I was going to end up moving to Brighton, Birmingham, or maybe even Manchester. About a week later, I went around to my flat in the middle of the night to grab a few bits and bobs, but when I got there, the place had been trashed. Whoever my boss had sent had done something to the lock because it didn't look like anything was wrong until I tried to put my key in the door, and it creaked open from the force. Inside, my flat looked like a bomb had hit it. They'd smashed my telephone, ripped up my sofa, broken all my records, and from the smell of the bedroom, they'd gone to the toilet all over my clothes. I didn't take anything with me. There was really nothing to take. The only thing that mattered was getting to my mum's, and then getting her on a coach to Manchester, the furthest of my options, before anything happened to her. 2 guys had already been over asking where I was, so she knew that I was in some sort of trouble. But it still took some convincing to get my mum to pack a bag. She didn't know how I made my money, so I had to spill the beans on her son being a bit of a naughty boy before she understood how serious things were. I told her the men looking for me were bad people, and that the next time they darkened her door, they might hurt her as a way of getting to me. The next day, me and Mum were in a B&B up in Manchester. I had a few quid in my pocket, so I found us both places to stay quite quickly, and then after that, it was a case of trying to go straight and earn an honest living for the first time in my life. No one ever found us, but at night the nightmares did. I dreamed that someone was zipping me into a suitcase and then shoving me under a bed, and I'd wake up scared thinking someone was at the door. But no one ever was. It was just my imagination. Sometimes I wonder if the cops ever got anywhere with Yuri's murder. I doubt it, but I also don't think that it was my former boss that had anything to do with it either. He just wanted me to get rid of the suitcase, and if for some reason he had wanted Yuri dead, then he'd surely have given the job to someone more cold-blooded and reliable than myself. No, I think someone else put Yuri in that suitcase. I don't know why, but I know they'd have to be pretty scary to be able to best a 6-foot barrel-chested Eastern European guy like Yuri. Then to twist him up like that, to snap his arms and legs and fold him in half. It takes a very frightening person to do something like that. A person I'm very glad I never had to meet. Back in the late 80s, I was slinging keys as a landlord here in New York City, managing a couple of walk-ups over in the East Village. They weren't fancy, just a couple of crumbly brick buildings with tenants who paid late and pipes that groaned louder than a drunk on St. Paddy's. I had some real crazy tenants from time to time. Not all of them were bad. There were some good ones, don't get me wrong. But out of the bad bunch, the worst guy was the guy that lived in apartment 4. Because sometimes, what happened there still crawls into my head at night. It started with a phone call one afternoon in July. It was hot as hell outside, and I was in my office in the back of a deli on Avenue A when the phone on my desk started ringing loud. The lady's voice on the other end was polite, almost sweet, and she said something like, "Excuse me, sir. I'm looking for my uncle, Albert Russo. I think he rents an apartment from you on East 10th. And I figured that she was talking about Al. He was a quiet guy in his mid-60s who always slipped the rent under my door in an envelope like clockwork. And I told her, yeah, I had an Albert in 4, and then asked who was calling. It was his niece, a girl named Clara, and she hadn't heard from him in weeks. Uncle Al hadn't been picking up his phone and she was getting worried, but since she didn't want to risk the cops kicking his door down just to find his phone unplugged, she figured that she'd call me first. I appreciated that, a whole lot actually, and when she asked if I could let her into his apartment so she could check on him, I was only too happy to help her out. A few hours later, I grabbed my keys and headed over there to meet that niece, Clara. When I got there, I saw a blonde lady who looked to be in her 30s standing outside number 324. I introduced myself and she thanked me very politely before we went inside, but there was still this kind of background tension. We both knew that there was a chance something bad had happened to her Uncle Al, and whatever that thing was, we were about to walk right into it. We climbed the stairs to apartment 4, then when we got to Albert's door, I knocked hard. I yelled something like, "Hey yo, Al, it's me, Tony, open up." But it stayed quiet on the other side. I knocked again, yelling a little louder, but still nothing. As I fished the key from my pocket, I remember Clara's face getting very tense, like she was bracing herself for whatever was inside. Then I unlocked the door, pushed it open, and the smell hit us like a brick to the face. It wasn't just bad. It absolutely turned our stomachs inside out, like a mix of something sharp and sour that stung your nose. And I gagged and covered my mouth with my sleeve. Clara was coughing before her hand flew up to her face, and I don't suppose either of us wanted to go inside, but I guess I figured that we had to, so we did. The curtains were drawn tight, so the apartment was very dim. I fumbled for the light switch, and when I flicked it on, I wish I hadn't. The place was disgusting. Trash bags were piled in corners. There were plates crusted with old food, and there was a low hum that I quickly realized was flies buzzing all over the place. We took a few steps inside the small, cramped apartment, then Clara pointed toward the half-open bedroom door. I nodded, trying to keep it together, then moved towards it. I kept my mouth and nose covered, but every step felt like wading through molasses as the air got thicker and the smell got even worse. Then when I got to the bedroom door, I pushed it all the way open and froze. There on the bed was something. To me, it looked like a decomposing body lying under a stained sheet. Flies were swarming it, dipping in and out of the fabric like it was their own personal buffet. I'd seen bodies before, but nothing as bad as that. Nothing even came close. I remember how Clara gasped and clutched my arm. She asked if that was her uncle, but I couldn't answer. I know I shouldn't have, but I stepped forward and reached out and pulled back the sheet, and my hands were shaking. But what we saw underneath was absolutely horrifying. It looked like a person at first. At least, it had the same shape. There were what you could imagine to be arms, legs, a head, but the skin was bloated and splitting open in places like rotten fruit. Flies poured out of the cracks, and the eyes, Jesus Christ, the eyes looked like they were completely gone, just black pits with nothing inside of them. I stumbled back, but Clara was already out of the room. I remember hearing her shoes on the stairs, hitting them very fast as she bolted out into the street. And I followed her down. She was outside completely in tears. I told her to wait where she was and then ran to a payphone to dial 911. And my heart was hammering at 100 miles an hour by the time I got there, and although I could barely get the words out, I did, screaming that there's a body. Please hurry. I told them the address and the cops showed up quick. Two tough-looking sons of bitches who looked like they'd seen everything. And they took one whiff inside apartment 4 and gagged, muttering something about another damn decomp. EMS rolled in and I saw the Vaseline in their noses as they hauled their gear upstairs. Claire and I went outside and I did my best to try and console her. But after maybe 15 minutes of EMS being up there, things started to get weird. I overheard one of them saying something to the cops about calling forensics in, and I knew that wasn't right unless they suspected some kind of foul play. Within the hour, the building was crawling with guys in white suits carrying all kinds of equipment along with a couple of cameras, and after a while, one of them, the short dude with glasses, came down looking like he'd just seen a ghost. He walked right up to me and asked if I was the landlord. Then when I said I was, he told me how the thing on the bed, the thing we thought was Uncle Al, was not human. And this made Claire's head shoot up because, as messed up as the situation was, it was great news to her. If the thing on the bed was not human, then it couldn't have been her uncle, right? And she begged the guy with the glasses to tell us more, but he said that we had to wait for the lab results to come back. After that, the cops decided they wanted to ask us a few questions, and I told them everything I knew, but Clara knew more. Al was a retired school teacher, and he lived alone, and he didn't appear to have any known enemies. The cops then searched the apartment and, for the most part, found nothing but more trash. But in the freezer, the lowest compartment was almost full to bursting with all kinds of meat. And a couple of weeks later, I got a call from the precinct. The results were in, and they were worse than I could have guessed. That thing on the bed, it definitely wasn't Albert, but what it was a pile of mashed up animal corpses. Apparently there were pigeons, rats, squirrels, raccoons, even some missing cats and dogs from around the neighborhood. Forensics said they'd only been arranged to look human, with the bones and flesh stitched together with wire like some kind of sick art project. And I almost threw up when I heard that, and I never saw how Clara took it, but it probably wasn't good. Sure, her Uncle Albert was probably still alive, but what kind of condition was he in? No sane man disappears and leaves a meat sculpture lying in their bed. So even if they found him, what kind of a person were they bringing home? I heard the cops were looking for him for a long time. They put out missing persons reports, checked local hospitals, and they even dragged the East River, but they never found anything. I kept in touch with Clara for a while, calling every now and then to check in and see if she'd heard anything about it or not, and she'd always answer, but the reply was always the same. No news. I'll let you know if he turns up. She never did call back with any good news, and after a while I just stopped calling. Not because I stopped caring, but because I figured all I was doing was giving her painful reminders. I always wondered if Clara knew more than she was letting on. Was there a history of odd behavior with Al? Some additional reason she came to his landlord first instead of just calling in a welfare check? I never pushed her on it. Clara was always very sweet, and I know families can be complicated. I just wish I had the answers to all the questions I have about old Albert and that meat person he left behind in his bed. I've been a landlord in San Francisco for damn near 40 years, long enough to see every kind of tenant you can imagine. Hippies, tech bros, deadbeats, you name it. I'm just a working class guy, born and raised in the Mission, scraping by on the rent from a couple of old apartment buildings. They're not anything special, but they're home to folks who need a roof. Most tenants come and go, leave nothing but late rent notices or maybe a couch too heavy to move. But there was a guy in apartment 2B, and his story still haunts me even all these years later. Now this was back in 1989 when James first moved in. He was a scrawny-looking kid in his early to mid-20s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a very nervous smile. You know the type. He said he was a grad student, studying some kind of chemistry, molecules and compounds, stuff like that. He had a deposit, good references, and a promise to keep things very quiet, and he seemed like the perfect tenant, and for a while he really was. Rent came on time, and there were no parties, and he had no complaints. And I barely thought about the kid. He was just another name on a lease. And then, maybe 4 months in, that's when the trouble started. Apartment 3B, as in the one directly above James, was home to a girl named Maria, a young bartender who worked nights at a dive bar, and she called me up one morning with a complaint. She told me something was stinking up her place, something that smelled like chemicals and burnt plastic, and after doing a little investigating on her end, she discovered it was coming from 2B, as in James' apartment. And I figured it was a one-off, that maybe James spilled some cleaning stuff or accidentally started a small fire. Something like that anyway, I've seen it before. I told Maria that I'd check it out and let her know how things went. I knocked on 2B that afternoon, but James didn't answer, so I left a note under his door asking him to call me. He didn't get back to me. Then about a week later, Maria called again. Only this time, she was angry. She told me the smell had gotten worse, and that she couldn't even open up her windows without gagging. In response, I left a message on James's answering machine, and I basically told him that I had to inspect his place, that the lease said that I could, and that I didn't want him to make things any harder than they had to be. He called back that night saying he was busy with research, then asked if it could wait till the weekend. I told him sure, but that if he wasn't true to his word, I'd be considering eviction. A little harsh maybe, but I had other tenants to think about. So that weekend, I finally got access to 2B after almost 2 weeks of trying. Then, what I saw once I got inside damn near put my jaw on the floor. James opened up, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were all bloodshot, his hair was greasy, and the shirt that he was wearing was stained with God knows what. Then the second he welcomed me inside, I caught the smell. The place reeked, like a mix of bleach and something rotten. Then when I saw the kitchen, I realized what the source was. His kitchen barely even looked like a kitchen anymore. James had turned it into a goddamn home laboratory. There were like glass beakers and test tubes and several Bunsen burners, as well as dozens of bottles containing liquids with names that I couldn't even imagine pronouncing. There were all kinds of wires running around the counter, all hooked to some buzzing machine that looked more like something from a sci-fi flick than a harmless high school chemistry experiment. And I asked James what the hell I was looking at. And after politely telling me not to touch anything, he said it was his research. I thought it might have been drugs, like he was making them in his apartment, but he swore what he was doing wasn't illegal, and that he was happy to have the cops come over to inspect his work. Legal or not, it was still causing trouble for people upstairs, and having smelled it myself, I understood why everybody was distressed. In fact, I could tell the fumes were drifting up from his kitchen window, which he kept cracking to vent the stink. I told him flat out that he had to stop what he was doing, that he was annoying his fellow tenants, and that if he didn't stop by the end of the month, he was gone. James nodded, then mumbled something about how he'd scale back. I thought that might be the end of it, but boy howdy, was I wrong. Less than a week later, Maria called again, and that time, she sounded like she was almost in tears. She told me the smell was back and that it was worse than ever, and how it smelled like something was dying down there. I remember sighing as I rubbed my temples and then told her that I was done playing, and that I'd served James eviction papers by the end of the month. And she sounded relieved, incredibly relieved actually, but less than an hour later, she called me a second time. I remember thinking, Christ, what is it now? His meth office has exploded? But when I did, that wary frustration transformed into another emotion entirely. I answered Maria's call, and I was halfway to putting on the most polite and patient tone of voice I could possibly muster, when Maria started yelling down the line at me. She was saying crazy stuff like, James is up there screaming now like he's hurt. I've already called 911, but I figured I should let you know. I immediately got this sick feeling in my stomach, like something terrible was about to happen, so I jumped in my car and drove over to the apartment building. By the time I got there, cop cars and an ambulance were already clogging up the street, and neighbors were out on the sidewalk gossiping and kind of craning their necks as they tried to get an idea of what the hell was going on. I remember pushing through the crowd before coming face to face with a cop who looked far too young for the job. I said I was the owner of the building and that I had proof in my car if he needed to see it. He told me he couldn't share anything right then, and that if I waited outside, they'd come talk to me first chance they got. It was frustrating, not being allowed into my own goddamn property. Then, maybe a minute or two later, I saw Maria among the crowd. She rushed up to me and thanked me for showing up, and then told me the cops had smashed their way into James's apartment, but wouldn't tell her what they found. I stayed outside for maybe another half hour or so, reassuring the rest of my tenants that they'd be allowed back into the building once the cops had made sure that it was safe. After that, I spoke to that same young-looking cop who told me to expect a phone call in the next few hours, and after that, I drove home. The young cop was right, and at around 8 that evening, I got a call from a detective about what happened to James. I figured that he'd been taken to the hospital, but to my shock, the detectives told me James was dead. And that changed the whole situation for me right there, and I suddenly went from angry and confused to feeling terrible for him and any family he might have. Once the shock had worn off a little, the detective started asking me all kinds of questions. Things like, when did I last see James? What was he doing? And was there anything weird about him the last time I saw him? And I told them everything, from the lab to the smells to how he looked like he hadn't been sleeping. The detective didn't tell me much in return, only that they suspected murder and weren't entirely sure yet. I was also warned to stay away from that apartment until the cops were done with their investigation, but I didn't argue. The last thing I wanted was to walk in on whatever mess they'd found. Days dragged by and the cops still wouldn't let anyone near the apartment, so naturally, rumors started swirling. Maria told me that she heard the cops muttering about burns and stuff like that, and another one of my tenants claimed they saw guys in hazmat suits going into that apartment. I tried not to let my mind linger on it too much, but still, questions got under my skin. Namely, what the hell had James been trying to do? When the police finally cleared the scene, I went into the apartment to see what they'd left. The place had been stripped almost completely bare, and they'd taken all of James's lab gear and books. It was almost like he'd never been there to begin with, except for one thing: the bathtub. It was old, cast iron covered in enamel, same as every unit in the building, but after James's death, this one had burn marks on it. They were black charred streaks curled into the shape of someone lying there. The burn was deep too, etched into the metal, but the rest of the bathroom was spotless, and there were no smoke stains and no ash. Just that terrible silhouette burned into the enamel of the tub. I stood there, staring, feeling this sort of deep unease creeping over me. And then I walked out, my hands shaking a little as I locked the door behind me. There was no way that I was renting that place out again without replacing that tub. And it cost me near $800 to replace it at the time, but I didn't care. I just wanted that gone. And the cops closed that case a few weeks later, saying that it's all just been some terrible accident. Apparently, James had been warned already about lab safety at the school that he was going to, something about volatile compounds, and they figured that he was running some rogue experiment or selling drugs or something too wild for the university, and it backfired. Then when it did, he jumped into that tub and tried to put himself out, but I guess maybe he couldn't, and so he died. I agreed that it all sounded like some horrible accident, like that kid with wings who flew up too close to the sun and got his ass burned, but a part of me doesn't see how it all adds up. I'm not some scientist, but I know fire. So how does a guy burn so bad it scars metal but the rest of the apartment stays completely fine? And if water didn't stop it, what the hell kind of chemical fire was that? But maybe the worst thought of it all involves whatever James was chasing. I mean, what was he chasing, if even the scientists at the school he went to didn't touch it? And as the months went by, life went back to normal. I got a new tub and a new tenant there, but they didn't stay long, as no one really ever did. They would oftentimes complain about weird smells, faint and chemical, even with the place scrubbed top to bottom, and I couldn't get that smell out of the apartment no matter how hard I tried, and the same applied to my mind, too. I'd be fixing a leak or collecting rent, and That burned silhouette would flash into my head, just as clear as the day that I saw it. And I did some digging, asking around, and found a guy who knew James at that school, and he said James was obsessed with rewriting matter, something about breaking down the building blocks of life and putting them back together. And to me, that definitely sounded like he was on drugs, or maybe some mad scientist, I don't know. But not only had James believed in this, but he also claimed that he was close to cracking it too. These days, I have a whole new section added to my rental agreements all about the use of volatile or flammable chemicals within the apartment complex. Some potential tenants, while reading it though, have said things to me like, "Wow, what a weird thing to have to write into a rental agreement." And I tell them that I've seen everything in my years as a landlord. And I imagine I sometimes smile when I say it too, but I don't imagine that smile reaches my eyes at all. Because whenever someone mentions that little chemical clause, as I call it, I'm reminded of what they say about rules, and how more often than not, they're written in blood. I'm from the south side of Chicago, and I'm a landlord who keeps a few rundown buildings afloat. My pops left me 3 6-person apartments in Englewood. Still own 2 of them, and I've been wrenching pipes and cashing rent checks ever since. It's hard work, and sometimes I think that I'll end up in a padded cell one day because of it, but I'm just too damned old to do anything else by now. Most of my tenants are decent, hard-working folks just trying to make it through the month. But every once in a while you get a real closet psycho. And let me tell you, of all the ones I ever dealt with, Gerald tops that list. His name was Gerald, or at least that's what he put on the lease, and he moved in during the summer of '96. He was a skinny dude, he had a scruffy beard and dark eyes that just never seemed to blink. And he always wore this ratty trench coat too, even in July when the city's absolutely cooking. And I really wasn't sure about him at first, and I guess in the long run, I was right to be unsure. But he always paid his rent early, always in cash, and he used to slip the envelope under my door, very quiet, first thing in the morning. The only downside is that every so often he'd come through the door at 3 a.m., carrying whole cases of what sounded like glass bottles. He'd go jingling all the way up the stairs, waking almost everybody up as he went, but aside from that, he was a pretty good tenant. Right up until he wasn't. Gerald had been living there for just a couple of months when the sewer line in his building crapped out. The whole basement was a swamp of this stinking sludge, and tenants were starting to lose their minds. There was an old widow in one of the apartments who swore that her cat got sick from the smell and that if it died, she was going to sue me. And I couldn't afford a plumber till the city reimbursed me for the damages, so to keep my ass out of court, I figured that I had to snake the drains myself. I grabbed the heavy-duty drain snake that I kept at home, the kind that you actually crank by hand, along with some gloves and a bucket. Then I threw some rags and a flashlight into my car before I drove over to the building. When I got there, I found the bypass cleanout plug in the basement, set down a bucket to catch any mess, and then popped off the trap and started feeding that snake's cable into the pipe. I started easing it around the bends, probing for any blockage, and then there it was. I felt something kind of squishy but solid, and that was obviously blocking the pipe. I figured it was probably a combo of hair and grease and who knows what else, so I started poking and prodding at it with the drain snake to try and dislodge it. I was pulling, pushing, twisting, and yanking, and then suddenly, pop. The mass of whatever comes unstuck, and it was mission accomplished in my mind, but it also meant a bunch of toilet water was about to come spilling out into the bucket, so I took a step back and prepared myself for the smell. All kinds of slop came splashing out, and as it did, the force dragged out the offending cloggers, so to speak, which splashed down into the bucket with this very disgusting plop. Like I said, I figured it'd be one of those hair and grease balls that I've seen so many times before, or maybe a kid had flushed their teddy bear down the toilet. Stranger things have happened to me. But when I saw it coming out of that pipe, it didn't look like any kind of hairball I'd ever seen before. with my hand covering my mouth and nose, I walked over to that big old plastic bucket and looked inside. There, floating in the water, was something I can only describe as a huge snail without a shell. It was like a big lump of slimy gray-green flesh, but when I poked at it with the head of that drain snake, it didn't move. And I thought that it might be some kind of fungus or slime mold or something like that, but like I said, I've never seen anything like it before in all my years of unblocking drains. Seeing as it was floating in a bucket full of sludge, it's not like I went in for a closer look. I just poured the bucket's contents into a larger sewage drain outside, flushed the pipes in the house to make sure that they were all totally unblocked, then went home and took a shower after cleaning up the basement. And I felt like Hercules after completing a task like that, but there was still the issue of the blockage and how it had gotten there. So after a well-earned rest, I drove back to talk to my tenants. It was early evening when I arrived, the best time to catch everyone at home. Everyone opened their doors and assured me that they hadn't been flushing anything that might have caused a blockage. All except Gerald, who I figured was out working at his night job. I didn't make a habit of entering a tenant's apartment without their express permission, but let's just say that I had a sneaking suspicion about old Gerald. See, I had exactly zero troubles with the drains of that house until Gerald moved in, and in the few months that he'd been there, I'd never seen inside his apartment. So since the whole sewer water in the basement thing constituted a health violation, I figured that was as good a reason as any to grant myself emergency access and do a little apartment inspection. I knocked on Gerald's door for the second time just to make sure that he wasn't home. Then, when I got no answer, I used the spare key I had and let myself in. Inside, the place was like a museum of weird. That's really the best way I can put it. None of the furniture matched and everything looked really old too. Not the classy antique old, the rickety, rotten kind. There were houseplants everywhere, weird, creepy-looking paintings hung on the walls, and there were stacks of books lying around with words that looked like Latin running down the spines. I called out Gerald's name again just in case he definitely wasn't there, and then threw in something about checking his pipes too. And when I got no reply, I was 100% convinced that he was at work, so I started towards the bedroom, and that's when I saw it. The utility closet at the end of the hall, and it was padlocked shut. Now, I don't allow any locked utility doors in my apartments. If you want to keep a safe or a lockbox or something, that's your business and I'll allow it. When it comes to utility closets that contain things like boilers, pipes, or fuse boards, I need to access them 24/7 for safety reasons, obviously. As I went to get my bolt cutters, I remembered that was the closet Gerald's water heater was in, and I wondered what the hell he needed to padlock it for. I snipped the lock, pushed the door open, then the second I looked inside, my stomach did a flip. Up and down the walls above the water heater, Gerald had installed a series of shelves, and lining them were a series of glass jars. They were filled with murky-looking water, and in each one, something was floating. From where I was stood, it didn't look like pickles or peaches or anything like that. It was something organic, sure, but it looked more like chunks of something familiar. And that's when it hit me. They were the exact same things as what had plopped out of that pipe in the basement. And not even a second later, I heard a floorboard creak behind me. I spun around, and there was Gerald, standing in the doorway, trench coat hanging over one arm. And he asked me, "What are you doing?" And I told him about the drains, about the blockage, and then asked what the hell was in those jars. Gerald just looked at me for a second and smiled. Then, in a tone so eerie that I remember it clear as crystal, even all these years later, he told me, "They're my friends." Like he was talking about pet dogs or something. I told him to stop playing with me, and asked him again what the hell he blocked my drains with. Gerald just kept smiling like he knew a dirty secret about me, and then said, "You shouldn't be here." And he was right. I had no right to be in there, not unless it was an actual emergency. But since I knew that it must have been him that was responsible for blocking the drain somehow, and since he had no right to be locking his utility closet like that, I gave him a little talking to before I booked it out of there. Now, back in my truck, I called my cousin Nicky. See, he's a cop, and I told him about the freaky stuff that I saw in Gerald's apartment. How I thought that it was probably drug-related or something like that. But he said unless Gerald was either cooking meth or skinning people alive in there wasn't much that the police department could do. Now, before he hung up, he told me to just serve an eviction notice and get him gone legally. So that's what I did. I typed up a 30-day notice that night, citing lease violations, unauthorized modifications, health hazards, whatever the hell I could throw to make it stick. Then, the next morning, I slid it under Gerald's door before I lost my nerve. And he didn't fight it. He didn't even try and talk to me about it. He stayed quiet, but his neighbors didn't. The old woman said that she'd heard weird noises coming from that apartment at night. And then an old friend, Jamal, in 3A, mentioned seeing Gerald carrying a jar down the fire escape at night, cradling it like it was a real precious thing to him. And I told them everything would be fine, that Gerald was leaving soon, but I have to admit, it definitely creeped me out too. The day before his 30 days were up, I got a call from that old lady saying the hallway outside Gerald's apartment stank to high heaven. And not only that, but she'd heard him screaming and crying in the middle of the night. I drove over right away, and the stench inside Gerald's apartment was unbearable, but it didn't take long to figure out where the smell was coming from. And by the looks of things, he was long gone. There was no note, but all of his stuff was missing. Everything except a single jar which laid smashed on the kitchen floor, with a puddle of what smelled like liquid death surrounding it. The smell was so bad that it stung my eyes. I gagged, covering my mouth with my sleeve, and then turned around and walked out again. I eventually called a hazmat crew, thinking that it must have been some kind of biohazard, and that cost me a solid $1,000 that I didn't have, but they cleaned it up, and they didn't ask any questions either. I figured that was the end of it. Gerald was gone, the unit was empty, and I could just re-rent it once the smell aired out. But that stench stuck around, kind of sharp, acidic, and rotten, like it had seeped into the walls and floorboards. Tenant started moving out. The old lady said that she saw something in her bathtub one night, pale and wriggling, gone when she turned on the light, and I told her it was just her imagination, but Jamal said that he caught his kid staring at that drain up there, and when he asked what he was doing, he also said that he saw something. I comped them a month's rent just to reassure them that everything was fine, but they eventually moved out anyway not long after. And by the summer, the building was half empty and I was hemorrhaging money. I hired a priest from St. Sabina's to bless the place, figuring that it couldn't hurt to get a little positive PR going, and he walked through that area, sprinkled holy water, but it didn't help. I was stuck for a while. I couldn't rent it, but I couldn't afford to lose that building either, and it got to the point that I thought about burning the place down just to collect on the insurance. But knowing my luck, I'd have been caught right away. In the end, I was forced to sell, and I lost a lot of money on the sale too because the folks buying knew that they'd have to tear the place down and start again. They kept asking what caused the smell, but all I could tell them was the truth. I didn't know. And I wish I did, or I wish I had, because that way, I'd have thrown Gerald out on his ass the second I saw those jars in his utility closet. Because whatever was in them, if they had gotten out, or if whatever that was growing inside of that building, there's no getting rid of it now. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, comedy is all about timing, ladies.